Good evening. Welcome once again to the Orsus Reading Room. Over the past few weeks, we've spoken to soldiers, sailors, spies, inventors, scholars, and friends. Tonight's guest is perhaps the quietest of them all, which, if I've learned anything over the years, usually means she's the one paying closest attention. When William first met her, she was an academic whose fascination with medieval manuscripts had taken her to the far side of the world. Well, in custody, to be honest. Today, she's the custodian of the repository, entrusted with preserving almost 9 centuries of accumulated knowledge. Dr. Eleanor Fleming, welcome. Thank you, Roger, although I still think William exaggerates terribly. William rarely exaggerates, he simply omits inconvenient qualifications. Yeah, that's true. He once described you to Hugo as the first person in 30 years who's read the footnotes before asking the questions. Did he really? He did. He never told me. William has an unfortunate habit of saying complimentary things only when the subject isn't in the room. That sounds exactly like him. Right, let's begin where we always begin, long before our chat and long before William. Who was Eleanor Fleming? Well, I was a child who was forever asking why. Apparently my parents found it exhausting. If someone answered one question, I'd immediately ask another. History fascinated me because people really agreed with one another. Every book contradicted another book. Every historian had a different opinion. I found that strangely comforting. Most people find contradiction rather irritating. Well, only if they're looking for certainty. I wasn't. I was looking for understanding. They're very different things. You realize that very young. I think so. History never struck me as a list of dates. It felt sort of alive, messy, complicated, human. The older I got, the more I realized the documents tell you almost as much about the people writing them as they do about the events they're actually describing, You described history as archaeology without a shovel. Did I? Yeah, you certainly did. I've shamelessly stolen that phrase ever since. Well, you're very welcome to it. You eventually specialized in medieval manuscripts. Why manuscripts? Well, manuscripts have personalities. Printed books are wonderfully efficient. Manuscripts are, conversations among copies, one copies another. Someone agrees, someone disagrees. Another hand appears 50 years later, correcting both of them. A margin is filled with questions, and somebody quietly writes, no. Sometimes that's the most interesting word on the page, because you're not merely reading the text. Exactly. You're reading the people, the doubts, the corrections, the hesitations. Eventually, you stop reading only the words, and you begin reading everything around them, including what isn't there. Well, especially what isn't there. Silence is often evidence. An omission can be as deliberate as a statement. If a chronicler refuses to mention someone, well, I immediately want to know why. I remember William once saying, never trust a document that answers every question. Well, he was absolutely right. Perfect certainty usually means somebody has tidied history up, and, real history is untidy. Your grandfather, Robert Andrew Fleming, how much did he influence you? Well, more than I realized at the time. Children don't usually see grandparents as historians. They're, simply granddad. And, I inherited some of his notebooks that I began to understand the man behind all the family stories. What struck you first? Well, there's the questions, not the answers. Page after page of questions, references, half-finished thoughts, cross-references to books I'd never heard of, sketches, maps, names circled without explanation. I remember thinking, he wasn't collecting information. He was pursuing something. He was looking for something. Did you know what? No, not then. Now, looking back, I'm not entirely sure he knew either. I think he knew there was a pattern. He simply couldn't see enough of it before he was tragically killed. Curiosity seems to run rather strongly through the family Fleming. Perhaps. I think scholarship is inherited. Curiosity might be. That sounds remarkably like William. Well, William believed curiosity was the beginning of wisdom. I think he distrusted certainty. He still does. Eventually, uh, we took you away from Alaska, really. I was thousands of miles from Scotland, thousands of miles from grandfather's notebooks, and I think that's where my story really began. But then again, I suppose I never really believed that. Alaska simply happened to be where you guys found me. I've been, had I been working in Prague or Bologna or Oxford, I suppose he'd appeared there as well. Quite probably. He's annoyingly persistent. Well, I know. Uh, I don't think anyone was interested in what I already knew. Everyone else wanted answers. William wanted questions. He kept asking, uh, what don't we understand yet? And, no one had ever asked me that before. Do you trust this organization? Well, I did, but not immediately. I trusted, his certainty. There are different things. William never persuades you. He simply behaves as though events have already unfolded. Eventually, you discover they usually have. Well, that's probably the most accurate description of Cochrane and William I've ever heard. It's also profoundly irritating. Everyone says that. Then you came to chatting, Dudhope. What struck you first? Well, the silence, not the absence of sound. It was a different kind of silence, the sort that you get in a library, places where generations thought carefully before speaking. The building didn't feel empty. It felt sort of, I don't know, patient, almost as though it'd been waiting. Ben noticed something almost immediately. He did. I found my way around the house without thinking. Corridors I'd never walked, doorways I'd never seen. I somehow knew where they all led. I mean, it made no sense whatsoever. Yet it was happening. Ben's grandfather used to say, there are families the house recognizes. At the time, I thought it was simply another Highland legend or a Highland saying. No, I'm not entirely sure. Well, I'm not entirely sure what it was. When did you first realize this wasn't simply another archive? You mean the repository? Well, the first time William unlocked the lower vaults, oddly enough, not because of what was there, I think because of what wasn't. Explain that. Well, archives usually strive for completeness. The repository doesn't. There were some big gaps, shelves where documents should have existed, references to volumes that have been removed, and lots of questions without answers. Most historians find that frustrating. I, on the other hand, found it fascinating. And why is that? Because somebody had deliberately, I suppose, preserved uncertainty. William wasn't collecting relics, he was preserving a long conversation. Some of the chapters had ended, others were still being written. That changed the way I looked at the entire thing, the whole repository. You said once something rather memorable. You told me that history isn't a museum, it's a workshop. I did? You did. I still believe it. Museums preserve objects. Repository, well, it preserves ideas, and those ideas change. Sometimes because we get new evidence, sometimes because someone asks a better question or the right question. William always encouraged questions. Relentlessly. The first answer was never enough. If I said, I think, he'd ask, why? If I explained, he'd ask, how do you know? If I produced evidence, he'd ask, what evidence would change your mind? At first, I found it exhausting, but, eventually I realized he wasn't questioning me. He was sort of teaching me how to question myself. Socratic method. Well, exactly. He wasn't trying to produce agreement. He was just trying to produce understanding. Most people assume William recruited you because of your academics. I never believed that. Well, no, neither have I. I mean, I had something to give that they and you didn't know. And, well, once you knew it, it changed everything. And then there was Helen. Yeah, Helen. Uh, I don't think anyone expected you to become Well, such good friends. Neither did I. I mean, imagine sitting somebody, sitting some opposite someone who doesn't remember events you've only ever studied. This is a lady who, her and her father isolated me and my family and my grandparents to Nikolai, Alaska in the 1950s. And it was a sad time. And, this is where everything had to do. I had to do everything. But, one evening, quite an ordinary evening, we spent hours discussing stuff from the 13th century. And eventually she simply sighed. She just looked at me and asked if I'd like another cup of tea. And suddenly Constantine had gone. Roman Empire had gone. All history had gone. She wasn't an immortal. She was just Helen, a woman making tea for a friend. And that was the moment everything changed. She once told me that you'd stop looking at her as history. Well, because she isn't. History is something she carries. It isn't who she is. And I think that's an important distinction. Did she ever talk much about the earlier times? Occasionally, but never dramatically. Never, it was absent-minded, really. Something like when we were in Antioch, before suddenly remembering that nobody else in the room had actually been there. I remember correcting one of her dates once. Well, how did that go? Well, she looked at me, smiled, and said, "Roger, I was there." That's so wonderfully Helen. Never unkind now. Gently devastating. So what did she teach you? I think perspective. Historians tend to compress centuries into chapters. Helen doesn't. To her, a century feels almost personal. She taught me that history isn't made of events, it's lives, millions of ordinary lives. And if we lose sight of those, then all these dates become meaningless. She changed your history. Not completely. Then H31 arrived. Yeah, everything changed after that. Not because of the statement, quite rightly, but we became fascinated by somebody else entirely. You mean the person writing in the margins? Exactly. Someone had been following the whole thing, correcting, questioning, cross-referencing, not rewriting history, continuing it. It felt as though two historians separated by generations were holding a conversation in pencil. I remember saying exactly that. Well, because that's what it felt like. Roger Harold asked questions, somebody decades later answered some, then asked better ones. History wasn't a sequence of books anymore. It was one enormous conversation stretched across generations. Then the two initials were noticed. Aye, WB. They're tiny, almost invisible. Well, as we found out, she was something quite incredible. Well, WB wasn't since she was family, not just mine, ours. She's a Coleman, another scholar quietly carrying the work forward without ever expecting recognition. Suddenly, Tom wasn't simply Hampton's grandson. You weren't simply Roger Graham. William hadn't gathered strangers. He recognized a certain continuity for the first time. I truly understand what that meant. It wasn't immortality, it was continuity. You cried. I did, didn't I? You thought nobody noticed. Well, William noticed. William notices everything. Yeah, he simply has the good manners not to mention it. You said once that, you said something that I thought that would never be forgotten. You said that a repository isn't William's greatest achievement. I remember thinking that's a remarkable thing to say. Well, people assume the repository is a place, a building, shelves, documents, maps, artifacts, books. It isn't. Those are simply, furniture. And what is it? The repository is memory, not information. Information tells you what happened, but memory reminds you why it mattered. They're not the same thing. You mean history with a heartbeat? Exactly. Without memory, history becomes just a chronology. With memory, it becomes human, humanity. At what point did you realize you become its custodian? People always imagine William held some great ceremony, that he had to be an enormous golden key, made a speech, declared me custodian. He didn't do that. No, that would have been entirely out of character. One day I simply realized that I already had the keys. He just stopped unlocking the doors. And without noticing, I'd started opening them, not because he told me to, but because he quietly, I suppose, decided I was ready. Did he actually ever say so? Only once. Really? We were cataloguing, well, what was it? Some of Hugo's Waterloo papers. I'd spent most of the afternoon arguing with him over an annotation I believe belonged in a different archive. Eventually, William looked up from his own work and said, "Good." I asked, "Good what?" He said, "You stopped asking where things belong. You started asking where they belong." Then he went back to reading. That was it. It's a very William promotion. Exactly. He never praised competence, only judgment. People often describe William as a leader. I've always thought of him as a teacher, the patron. So have I, although he would deny it. Naturally. He never wanted followers. He wanted people who could eventually disagree with him, and that's much harder. He encouraged argument constantly. If everyone agreed, he assumed someone hadn't thought about it hard enough. Do you know, I've often wondered why William deliberately chose historians. I don't think he did. I think he chose curious people. History just happened to be the language we all shared. That's an interesting distinction. History wasn't the objective, understanding was. You've now spent years preserving documents that span nearly 900 years. Does the responsibility ever become, heavy, too heavy? No, it's sacred almost. Heavy implies a burden. I've never felt burdened. I felt privileged. Imagine being trusted with the accumulated thoughts of generations. Imagine opening a document touched by someone who died centuries before you were born and knowing, well, that they hoped someone one day would read it carefully. And that's an extraordinary privilege. Even now, do you still discover surprises? Well, almost every day. That's the wonderful thing about archives. The documents never change. You do. You become capable of asking questions you weren't capable of asking 5 years earlier. The archive hasn't revealed something new. You've become something new. That's beautifully put. One day, many years from now, someone else will be sitting where you're sitting. Someone else will become custodian. Have you thought about that? Often. Does it worry you? Not in the slightest. Because the repository has never belonged to me or William or anyone. We've simply looked after it for a while. One day, I'll hand the keys to someone else, just as someone once handed them to William. That's how knowledge survives, not by ownership, by stewardship. Stewardship. Yes, history doesn't belong to us. We belong to history. The least we can do is leave it in a better condition than we found it. Last question for you. If a young historian were listening tonight, someone just beginning their journey, what would you say to them? Well, read widely, question everything. Don't fall in love with your first conclusion. Treat every document with respect, but never with blind faith. Listen carefully to people who disagree with you. And most importantly, remember that history isn't about proving you're right. It's about getting closer to the truth. You may never quite reach it. That's perfectly all right. It's the journey that matters. I think William would approve of that. He already has. Eleanor, thank you. Thank you, Roger. When we think about history, we often think of kings, battles, and revolutions. Perhaps we should think a little bit more about the librarians, the archivist, the teacher, the quiet men and women who preserved memory so that the rest of us can continue asking questions. Without them, history simply disappears. My thanks to Dr. Eleanor Fleming. My little monk said, until next time, good night.